2 weeks ago, I made a video on the coup in Myanmar. A coup is where the military will take over from the civilian government and impose its own laws. A country that is not unfamiliar with coups is the Central African Republic, and unlike other three-letter acronyms for political entities, it is both Central, African, and a republic. The reason I'm making a video about the Central African Republic today is because there have been recent developments in that rebel groups are advancing on the capital of Bangui, and it's very possible that in the next few months we might see a complete changeover of power. This would not be the first time that this has happened in the history of the CAR, and in this video I want to look at the roots of the current conflict, as well as some of the history of the Central African Republic, and if they can ever get out of this endless cycle of violence. The Central African Republic has several impressive prehistoric monuments, although it's likely that there was a mixing of several different cultures, with groups like Bantu speakers coming in from the south and Ubangian speakers coming eastwards from Cameroon that all blended together and now form part of the complex ethnic makeup of the CAR. By at least the 17th century, Arab traders from the north brought both Islam and took slaves from the region, and in fact this region became an important slave trading hub, with people like the Bobangi becoming very important slave traders. And it's in the 18th century that there was the rise of the kingdom of the Bangassou. And this was along the lines of the Ubangi River, and this brought the interest of the Europeans because, of course, by the later 19th century, the scramble for Africa was in full swing. In this case, the French established themselves in the Congo at Brazzaville in 1880, 2 years later formalizing it as the French Congo, and then sending their soldiers further inland, penetrating the area that is now the Central African Republic around 1885, and then incorporating it into their expanding French holdings. They actually modelled the colony there on the Belgian Congo, so that private companies took up large areas of the land and tried to strip it of its natural resources as cheaply and quickly as possible, basically leaving a terrible situation for the native labourers who had to work in awful conditions. Outbreaks of disease, as well as the fact that many were forced into labouring on the new Ocean-Congo Railway, led in 1928 to the Kongo-Wara Rebellion, in which tens of thousands of the native people from the Central African region rebelled against the French, although ultimately they were unsuccessful and conditions remained harsh. In 1940, of course, the Second World War in Europe saw the fall of France as it was invaded by Germany. However, in Africa, the Central African Republican region joined into the Free French forces and fought against the Axis for the remainder of the war. This is partially why in 1946 the French were moving towards decolonizing their African holdings, and why they first allowed the native people to vote for themselves. This led to the election of Barthélemy Boganda and became the first representative of the CAR in the French government. However, he quickly became disillusioned because his anti-racist stance was getting nowhere in France, and so in 1949 he returned and formed MESAN. Now, MESAN stands for the Mouvement pour l'évolution sociale de l'Afrique noire, basically the movement for the social evolution of Black Africa. In 1957, MESAN won a total of 97% of the vote, which was every legislative seat, and led to Boganda becoming the president of the Grand Council of French Equatorial Africa. And within a year of this, he was able to establish the independent Central African Republic and served as its country's first prime minister. Unfortunately, in 1959, his life would be cut short as he died in a plane crash, and the next person to take over was David Dacko, his cousin, and he became in 1960, when France officially recognized the independence of the Central African Republic, its first official prime minister. However, he was very different to his cousin and soon established a one-party state, throwing his political opponents out of the country and establishing himself as the president for life. However, things would turn out quite differently, as in 1965, the Saint-Sylvestre coup d'etat would see a colonel of his by the name of Jean Bokassa become the new president. However, Bokassa was a very interesting and very eccentric figure, and in 1976, rather than remaining the president, he decided to crown himself Emperor Bokassa I of the Central African Empire. But the story gets even stranger. Now, most children who have to wear a uniform at school, like we did in the United Kingdom, really weren't a fan of wearing it, myself included.
Oh, no.
In all seriousness and all joking aside, in the Central African Empire as it was at the time, this actually led to a regime change, because Bokassa's government pushed through that school children would have to buy school uniforms from a company that was owned by one of Emperor Bokassa's wives. And in a country as poor as the Central African Empire was, this was a large problem, and so many came out in protest against this clear nepotism in 1979, which was cracked down upon incredibly harshly by the regime, resulting in the death of around 100 teenagers and children. Of course, the ex-colonial power France looked and thought this cannot go on, and so they intervened, sending in paratroopers and deposing Bokassa's regime in favour of returning David Dacko from his exile. David would not last long, however, as in 1981 he himself was overthrown in another coup, this time by André Kolimba. Kolimba ruled through a military junta and decided to suspend the constitution until 1985, at which point semi-free elections were held, although his main opposition candidates were not allowed to run, so really it was a foregone conclusion. At this point, the membership of his party, the RDC, standing for the Rassemblement Démocratique Centrafricain, was optional. However, that was the party that became the ruling party because his main opponents weren't allowed to run in the elections. That is until 1990, when he came under increasing pressure from those who wanted to see more democracy, especially as this was the year in which the Berlin Wall fell, and so there were democratic movements that were gaining traction across the world. And actually there were many protests in the country for this, and they were soon supported by an international coalition, GIBAFOR, which were made up of Japan, the United States, the United Nations, France, Germany, the European Union, and the World Bank, which led in 1992 to a first round of actual free and fair elections. But when I said free and fair elections, I meant that Kolimba's regime claimed there was voter irregularity and suspended the entire thing. But GIBAFOR was having none of it, and in 1993 there was another election, in which case there was a clear winner in the form of the MLPC, standing for the Mouvement pour la Libération du Peuple Centrafricain. And they won 53% of the vote, and the leader of their party then became the president of the Central African Republic. His name was Ange Félix Batassé. Batassé's government faced many challenges, however, and they didn't really help themselves because they targeted the ethnic group called the Yakoma, of which Kolimba had been a member, and relieved many of their state positions within the government, which heightened ethnic tension. And in 1996 things had deteriorated to the point that there were 3 mutinies against the Batassé regime and various rebellions happening across the country. In 1997, this led to the Bangui Agreement, in which the United Nations decided to set up MINURCA, which stands for the United Nations Mission in the Central African Republic. And since then, there have been almost a dozen military interventions by the United Nations, leading to the Central African Republic sometimes jokingly being called the world champion of peacekeeping for the number of missions that occurred. The most serious threat would come in 2001, however, which was a coup attempt by one of his generals, François Bozizé, in the capital. But thanks to the intervention of Libyan and Congolese rebel soldiers that Batassé had brought in, he was able to turn the tide against them and regain the initiative. Eventually, he started to suspect François Bozizé of his involvement in the coup, and thinking that he was going to do another one, he managed to flee to neighbouring Chad with his loyal soldiers. That is until the militias in the capital that were loyal to Batassé started to try and find anyone involved in the coup and to take revenge on them in such a way that many of them also defected and joined Bozizé. That led to 2003, when Batassé was out of the country. Bozizé returned from Chad with his army and was able to defeat the Libyan and Congolese troops that were stationed in the capital and therefore take power for himself. But many in the country were unhappy with this unlawful takeover of power, and in 2004 this led to the first clashes of the Central African Republic Bush War. During this war, the Central African Republican government looked for aid from the former colonial power, from France, and they complied, sending in airstrikes to help the government against these rebels. And one of the larger rebel groups was called the UFDR, which is the Union des Forces Démocratiques pour le Rassemblement. Thanks to international mediation, a ceasefire deal between these rebels and the new government was struck in 2008, although an election that was held in 2011 was widely considered to be fraudulent, and so many of these groups started to take up arms again under the new name Séléka, which in their language means coalition, because this was a coalition of several of these different rebel groups that had previously rebelled against the new regime. What's interesting about these groups in the Séléka is the varying degrees that Islam plays an important role in their rebellion, as well as being politically against the new regime, they were also of a different religion, as most of the Séléka rebels were Muslim. This may just be because of where in the country they were rebelling. They were from the northeastern part, which had traditionally been Muslim. However, subsequent attacks on Christians in the country, especially Christian institutions, have added a religious dimension to the Séléka and to the groups that would come to fight against them. Now, in 2013, they marched on the capital and demanded that François Bozizé would resign. However, he was able to reach a deal with them. They dropped their demands for him to resign as long as they could choose an opposition prime minister, which then occurred. However, this was later reneged on, and the rebels drove Bozizé out of the country, and he fled to neighbouring Chad, leading to the arrival of Michel Djoudjocha as the new president. As well as the lootings, killings, rapes and more of the Séléka in the lead up to Michel Djoudjocha becoming the president, this also created a problem for many people within the country, as Djoudjocha was Muslim, which was around 9% of the population of the Central African Republic is Muslim, whereas far more in the nation were Christian, and these were now being openly targeted by the Séléka without anyone to stop them. This led to the creation of groups known as the Anti-Balaka, and the etymology of Balaka I thought was rather interesting, is from the language of the young illiterates who formed Séléka's armed opposition, and who chased the Muslim Anti-Bales Atilaka, Anti-Tilaka bullets. So the term laka, of course balai in French is for bullet, the term laka in the street language of the Central African Republic means an AK-47. So the anti-balakas are therefore the bearers of the grigris, meant to stop Kalashnikov bullets. And the grigris are these little bits of, they look like cotton that are worn on by many African rebels. These are believed to deflect bullets or to make them invulnerable to the bullets. As you can see, there's sort of small bits of cloth that they will wear, as you can see with the gentleman there in the yellow vest with the little bits of cloth that are attached. So that's the anti-Balaka groups, are essentially Christian militias that rose up to, initially their goal was to protect Christians being victimized by the Séléka, although as we will see they then also went on to the offensive and used their power to attack Muslim minority groups caught in the crossfire, just as the Christians had been caught in the crossfire when the Séléka had the upper hand. Around 200,000 people were displaced in the Central African Republic, and this led to France calling for the UN to step up their game and to send in more peacekeeping forces. Djoudjocha also did his part and disbanded the Séléka, but several of the Séléka groups refused to disband and became known as the Ex-Séléka, and he had no control over what they were doing. The UN finally did step up their efforts in 2014 and moved in with several thousand soldiers to help the 6,000 strong African Union presence in the area to maintain the peace. This resulted in the disarmament of many of these remaining ex-Séléka groups by the UN. However, this caused a problem because the anti-Balaka groups were not being disarmed. This meant that the Muslim militias had no more firearms, but the Christian militias did, and so they went out on a revenge spree against the now defenseless Muslim communities. A US ambassador to the UN, for example, estimated that 417 out of 436 mosques in the Central African Republic had been destroyed by anti-Balaka forces during the fighting. Now, Djoudjocha actually resigned in 2014 under international pressure and as the result of a peace conference held in neighbouring Chad, while a further round of talks was held in the Congo, the neighbouring country of course, and this led to a final peace agreement between the two sides. Now this actually led to a divided Central African Republic with, in the area of the northeast, the Ex-Séléka faction still in control, whilst in the very southwest you had the anti-Balaka forces, while other areas were controlled by disparate rebel groups and the central government itself. So a very chaotic situation. In 2015, however, this region of the northeast declared its own independence, becoming the République de Logone, although it hasn't been internationally recognized. In 2016, there was another election, during which 63% of the vote was won by the presidential candidate, Faustin Archange Touadéra. And Touadéra is very interesting because he didn't include either the Séléka or the Anti-Balaka in his formation of government, which is perhaps surprising considering that they controlled so much of the country and were very powerful forces. And that leads us to last year, 2020, when much of the country was still controlled by these various but divided rebel groups, such as the Anti-Balaka, the 3R, MPC, FPRC, and UPC. However, what's interesting is that in 2020, in December of that year, they all joined together and formed a new group, the CPC, or the Coalition des Patriotes pour le Changement. And what's very interesting about this is that, of course, many of these other groups with the various acronyms were Muslim groups, but they joined together with the Christian Anti-Balaka, who had been sworn enemies just up until that point. A further factor is the ex-president Bozizé, who announced his candidacy but was rejected by the Constitutional Court, which said that he did not fulfill the good morality requirement of presidential candidacy, as he had been indicted for human rights abuses by the United Nations. Now, this will of course have annoyed the rebel groups, some of whom had been supporters of Bozizé in the past, but he is known to have met with them and perhaps promised them a share in the government if they are able to topple the current government to bring him back into power. 14% of the polling stations during the 2020 election were disabled by rebel groups and fighting, so it does look like they were attempting to disrupt the election, and possibly because they are working with Bozizé, which is fairly likely. The government in charge at the moment under Touadéra are working increasingly with Rwanda and Russia to ensure their security. This is particularly interesting because all of these rebel groups that contain large parts of the country, they're worried that now that they are all working together under the CPC, they made a move towards Bangui, and so the government has started working more closely with the Rwandans and the Russians. The rebels started to attack certain towns in December of 2020 and were able to capture some of the largest cities in the country as they moved towards Bangui. And in fact, the only reason they weren't able to take Bangui is because of the aforementioned presence of the Rwandan and Russian, largely military advisors rather than ground soldiers, who are currently training the soldiers of the Central African Republic's army to fight against these rebel groups. But as it stands, the rebel groups have made a lot of progress in the early months of 2021, and Bangui is still far from safe. And so we'll need to watch out very closely how this situation will unfold in the coming weeks and months. But that will be a video for a future YouTuber to make, because as it stands, that is what we know about the situation in the Central African Republic. It's a very long story. It's a story full of coups and power takeovers, as there are many in that part of Africa, in Central Africa, neighbouring Congo as well, of course, and Rwanda. And hopefully things there will improve for the people who are being caught in the crossfire, as is usual. In the meantime, I hope you guys have enjoyed this video at looking at the very complex situation. This is of course just an introductory guide, as there are many more factors involved in these conflicts, but yes, an introductory look at the conflict in the Central African Republic. Let me know in the comments below if you have enjoyed that, and I hope you'll join me again next week on Friday for another video. I will see you all very soon. Have a lovely week.